Okay, I'll be presenting upon the topic on data science and basketball. I have always had an interest in sports, primarily football, but in recent years, I sort of developed an affinity for playing basketball and looking at the NBA and seeing the remarkable talent of these different players. So upon developing that interest, I also wanted to explore the different research that was out there in data science and how it benefits the world of basketball in particular. So when looking through a lot of this literature, you find a variety of different ways that data science has revolutionized the world of basketball, in particular the NBA, where different teams are using all sorts of very advanced data science techniques to try and remain competitive. We see that in instances where they're trying to find the optimal number of three-point shots, for example, that are taken in a particular game. For those who may not be familiar with the nature of basketball, you have different types of shots. You have a two-point shot, which is any shot inside of the three-point line, or a dunk or a layup, anything of that nature. You also have a three-point shot, which is any shot outside of the three-point line. And of course, three-point shot is notoriously difficult to take. As a consequence of that, people take fewer shots. But the upside of taking three-point shots is that you get one additional point relative to the two-point shot. So very interesting work has been conducted in the area to try and figure out, depending on the team that you have and the type of shooters that you have, what is the optimal number of three-point shots that should be taken for a given team to optimize the number of points that are scored in a particular game, depending on the roster that you have. Also, injuries are a major issue in the world of sports. Sometimes you have scenarios where you overload the particular player based on the number of minutes that they play. So they've also conducted work in trying to find the ideal number of minutes per night that a particular player should play so as to mitigate the chances of him being injured. And other areas in which the data science technology and techniques have been utilized, for example, in trying to predict whether teams will qualify for the playoffs, or trying to basically forecast and prognosticate about the performance of players or teams in the NBA. And that's the direction in which I think I'll focus on this presentation. I came across a very interesting paper entitled Application of Machine Learning, Application of Machine Learning in NBA datasets. It was done by Jingru Wang and Kishan Fan, and they focused on three different areas. One was All-Star prediction. The All-Star game is a game that is conducted for the most talented players in the NBA for a particular season. So the absolute elite of the elite are selected for a weekend where they compete on two different teams. And of course, to qualify for such a team, you have to be elected based on your skill and your demonstrated achievements throughout that season. And predicting who will qualify for that team, who will be selected for that team, has been a major area of research in the NBA. Playoff prediction is the second area. Playoffs, the NBA system is a very interesting one where you have the league that runs for the majority of the season. And at the end of the season, there's the NBA playoffs where only a select few teams qualify and then compete for the NBA championship. And a lot of these betting agencies try to figure out which teams are most likely to qualify for the playoffs. And in the world of betting, these sort of predictions are very, very important. And the third one for the paper focuses on is on the hot streak fallacy, or at least attempting to see if it is a fallacy or not. The hot streak basically is the notion, not specific to basketball, but when somebody experiences some sort of success in a particular shot or a particular game, they develop a sort of rhythm, and therefore the belief is that they're more likely to be successful going forward. So these are the three different areas that are explored in this particular paper. So the data set was retrieved from basketballreference.com. It was cleaned and explored, and the data was imputed. There was some missing information. The values were replaced with appropriate data. And the first thing that they attempted to do was perform clustering, but that did not work as it separated into too many clusters and too many different groups. So that proved to be an inappropriate form of determining whether a particular player would qualify for the playoffs, for the All-Star game or not. So they decided to use supervised learning and use decision tree classification specifically. So they created two different groups, all-star player and non-all-star players. And they trained the model based on the data that was provided. The decision tree model had an accuracy of about 95%. And the model was trained using 2019 data. And of course, the accuracy was produced due to the testing of that model based on the 2019 data. But then what they did in the paper subsequent to that model training was try to determine if the model could work on unseen data. And they provided 2020 data to try and determine if specific players would actually be qualified for the selection of the All-Star game. And it actually did a very good job, as players such as Zion Williamson and Zach LaVine and Bradley Beal were people who were produced by the model, and actually in reality, these people actually were selected for the All-Star game. So that was an interesting finding that they discovered in the paper. It was also found that most of the players were in that particular range, 21 to 28. And I guess that stands to reason, because in the world of sports, as people get older, their bodies tend to deteriorate and fatigue starts setting, and they aren't as effective as they would typically be when they were younger. So they found that the number of players largely decreased after 26. So that age seemed to play a major role in determining what players were able to get selected for the All-Star game. And that significantly seemed to influence their chances of being picked. And I guess that is something that we see all the time in not just basketball, we see it in football. Like in the world of football, for example, players, when you hit 30, and to some degree in basketball as well, when you're 30, you're considered old. But when you're 18, that's like young. So the younger you are, at least up to a point, the better your performance tends to be, as you're more physically able and less susceptible to injuries and fatigue and all these sort of things that happen over time. So the next component of the paper was playoff prediction, trying to determine which teams qualified for the playoffs or will qualify for the playoffs. Now, it says a lot of work has gone into attempting to predict which teams will make the playoffs, but the paper suggested that there was limited work trying to discuss the suitability of different data sets when working with supervised learning algorithms. That is to say that in the world of basketball, you have typical basic data, which takes into consideration very rudimentary components of the game, like field goal percentage and things of that nature. But then you have the more advanced metrics, which is a more recent development, given all of the advanced technology that we have today that is able to monitor the progression of the game in a far more meaningful way. So they wanted to determine if there was any significant difference in predictions based on the more traditional elementary data versus the more sophisticated advanced data. Right. So based on the decision tree model, 3 machine learning algorithms were performed: decision tree, the random forest, and gradient boosting. And they found that when they investigated the accuracy versus the depth of the decision tree, it showed that a depth of 7 was optimal, and it produced an accuracy of 70%. And we see a little illustration of the findings from the paper right there. So we also have here, they produced a feature importance plot, which I think was quite interesting, as these show some of the components in a game of basketball. Like we have right here, field goal percentage, 3-point percentage, 2-point percentage, blocks, steals, assists. And what they're trying to do basically is try to determine what attribute, what component of the game seems to have the biggest effect on the outcome of whether a team is going to qualify for the playoffs or not. And based on the results of the research, they found that the data point that had the biggest impact was field goal percentage. And the one that had just about close to the smaller effect was the blocks. And points seem to not really be able to predict as well as much, as you have different issues with points, as a team may score a certain amount of points on the road, but then they might score fewer points or more points at home and fewer on the road, or depending on the different teams and the styles of the team that they play, The points could differ, though you might have a team A beating team B beating team C, but team A isn't able to necessarily beat team C. So that was one of the interesting data points here that we found from the research, that the field goal percentage seemed to be the best indicator of who is going to qualify for the playoff. We can see that from dataset 2, as we talked about, we have the two datasets, the elementary data and the more advanced data. The dataset with the more advanced data yielded a higher accuracy. The dataset with the low accuracy, dataset 1 had more low accuracy as more elementary data was used. And from the previous slide, we saw that some features contributed almost nothing to the overall performance. And those features are recommended to have been removed. And we conclude that the advanced metric data was a better indicator of the qualification for the playoffs. So when the data is collected from the teams, the ones that have the more advanced metrics was able to prognosticate more accurately about the teams that are going to qualify for the playoffs. And lastly, we have the issue of the hot streak. The hot streak was considered to be a cognitive social bias where the person who experiences a successful outcome has a greater chance of success in future attempts. So the idea that, if I score one 3-point shot and then I score an next 3-point shot, then I have a better chance of scoring a 3-point shot given that I just scored the first 2 3-point shots. And that's what the paper endeavored to try and investigate. Is that really a thing? Is that just a myth? Is it something that's substantiated in actual empirical data? So the paper investigated the multilinear relationship between consecutive games, 3-point shooting percentage. Data for 27 players was used based on the rank of 3-point shots attempted in the 2018-2019 NBA season. 3-point shooting percentage for each game was grouped into 3 consecutive games. And the third game was the dependent variable depending on the first 2. As usual, the data was split into training and test data, and then the analysis was conducted. A linear regression model for 2 independent variables was implemented, where we had y hat is equal to beta 0 plus beta 1 x1 plus beta 2 x2, where x1 and x2 stood for the first 2 games percentage, and y hat was used to predict the third game's 3-point shooting percentage. The accuracy of the prediction using the mean estimate of the player's percentage over the whole season and the player's previous game were compared. The baseline for the experiment was that the prediction should be at least better than the mean estimator. Hence, a prediction is deemed to be successful if y hat minus y was less than or equal to y bar minus y, where y hat represented the predicted value that the linear equation is trying to produce. Y hat represents the mean estimator, and y actually represents the actual shooting percentage of the particular players that we are looking at. It found that since both models resulted in accuracy less than 40%, the hot streak idea was rejected. So they basically found out that when the analysis was conducted, there was actually no empirical data to substantiate the notion that a hot streak is actually a real thing. It's just something that I guess people have developed over time looking at basketball, but in reality, it's not something that is really substantial, can be substantiated by empirical findings. So that was basically the essence of that particular paper. And there's been quite a lot of other interesting work that's been conducted in the field of data science and basketball. It was also a very interesting area that was explored in terms of trying to determine what effect does pressure have on the actual output of a particular player in a particular game. But yeah, so this was just a quick paper that I came across and I found it quite interesting. And yeah, data science has a lot of application in the world of sport, and that's something I hope to really pursue in more detail going forward. So thank you for listening to me, and I'm open to any questions that you guys may have.
Yeah, thanks for that, Christopher. Interesting stuff. So in the beginning, you mentioned things like, looking at statistics of what's the optimal number of 3-point shots to take, etc. So was that based on papers you read, or is it stuff people just?
Yeah, there are variety. There are lots of papers on this particular area. So there are a lot of research papers that some of them are quite sophisticated as to the optimal number of 3-point shots. So that's actually research has been done because that is really he's kind of in a sense sitting on a gold mine there. Like for example, I'm not sure if people know who Stephen Curry is. He's like the most elite 3-point shooter known to the history of mankind. And of course, if you have a player like that on your team, the number of 3-point shots that that team should take probably would be higher than a team where the average 3-point percentage is quite low. So yeah, there's a lot of research on that particular area, and that's why I thought I should mention it before going into the specifics of this particular people.
Okay, yeah, as you mentioned, Curry, my daughter's dog is named Curry after him, but
Yeah,
aside. The other interesting area, of course, is this fantasy football league, right? Which you
Right.
probably know a lot more about than I do.
Yeah, I
I
never
guess
actually played it, but I know a lot of people who play it. Yeah, there's a lot of
Yeah.
money in that too.
yeah, so I'm sure people are applying data science to come up with the best solution. So
Yeah.
yeah. All right, thanks.
No problem.